Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank you all for being here. If you are looking for a seat, we have some additional seating right over here. So please, you can make your way to one of these seats. If you were sitting at a table and have an empty chair at your table, please put up your hand. We have some empty seats right up here in the front. So please find your way to a seat, either at one of these tables in the front or just back here. Again, I want to thank you all for being here. My name is Harold Mock. I'm the director of our leadership programs at Georgia College. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our Usery Forum on Leadership. This afternoon, we have the pleasure of hosting Rachel Galloway, British Consul General to the United States, based at the UK Consulate General in Atlanta. Before we begin, I must say that this event is being recorded. By participating in this program, you are consenting to being recorded. If you would prefer to view the recording instead of participating, please leave this meeting and email leadership.programs@gcsu.edu. We are honored to welcome Rachel Galloway to Milledgeville and to Georgia College. Samantha Payton will introduce Mrs. Galloway momentarily, but allow me briefly to say a few words about this event. The Usery Forum on Leadership is Georgia College's presentation discussion series on leadership and the public good. Our forum honors the memory of the 15th U.S. Secretary of Labor, W.J. Usery, Jr. This series is made possible through the generosity of Mr. and Mrs. Melvin and Elise Usery. Secretary Usery began his career as a machinist at the naval shipyards in Brunswick, and during the Second World War enlisted in the United States Navy and became an underwater welder on a repair ship in the Pacific. He built a long and storied career in service to his country and ultimately negotiated some of the most difficult labor disputes of the 20th century. Secretary Usery had a unique ability to bring people together in the name of ideas and causes bigger than themselves, and that's precisely what we honor and celebrate here this evening, embodied in our distinguished presenter. I'd like to acknowledge a few of our special guests who are here with us this afternoon. Although I've not laid eyes on all of them yet, but I do want to acknowledge Mr. Jimmy Childrey, who is joining us, who's a member of our leadership board, Mrs. Jane Kidd, who is our leader in residence, and a particular welcome to Caitlin Dean, who is head of press, political, and public affairs at the British Consulate General. So we want to thank you all for being here. Also acknowledge our president, Kathy Cox, our provost, Dr. Costas Spiro, and our associate provosts, Dr. Holly Roberts and Dr. Jordan Kofer. Thank you all for being here. We're also joined by some guests online, including alumni from across Georgia and the country. So whether you're a Bobcat or a Colonial or a Jesse, we want to welcome you this afternoon, and we hope that our conversation with Rachel Galloway will remind you why we all love Georgia College so much, that we have the opportunity to ask and answer important questions and to share in a commitment to something greater than ourselves. We hope to host you on campus again very soon. Most of all, students, I'm so glad that you all are here, and it's a great joy to me as a teacher that you all will learn about leadership from such a distinguished practitioner. Whether you're with us here in Milledgeville or you're dialing in this afternoon, we encourage you to join the conversation on social media using the hashtag #ForThePublicGood. Oops. You can also connect with us on social media at Lead Creatively. One of the most important elements in these events is that we hear from you, our students and our guests. You will have the opportunity to ask your questions of Ms. Galloway, and I encourage you to shape our conversation both in the room and online by asking good questions of the Consul General. I imagine that there are very few ideas that our guest will introduce to us this afternoon that would not be enriched by regularly reading a newspaper and engaging in informed debate from those with whom you agree and perhaps also with whom you disagree. I want to remind all of you that our Georgia College students, faculty, and staff have a free subscription to the New York Times in partnership with the American Democracy Project and supported by the Office of the Provost. It is only waiting for you to activate it. You can scan that QR code. Those QR codes are on your table as well, or you can go to accessnyt.com, select Georgia College from the drop-down, and I did it in under 60 seconds, and I'm twice your age, so if I did it in 60 seconds, you guys could probably do it in like 30 seconds. But please activate your free subscription to the New York Times. You can do it very easily online, and I hope that you will take advantage of that. You can go ahead and pull your phones out right now and do it, and we won't even judge you. If you are already a veteran reader of the New York Times and you're looking to go a step further, Russell Library has all of these periodicals on subscription and in the library along with dozens of others. These are some of my favorites, so I encourage you to enrich your intellectual life by regularly reading. And I will make a blanket promise to all of you. If you want help learning how to read a newspaper, I will sit down with you and we will figure it out together, I promise. And many of these are sitting on my desk right now in my office. But now is a great time to start maintaining a healthy news diet. So I encourage you to get started right now. With that, again, thank you for joining us here at the Usery Forum. I'll now ask Samantha Payton to introduce Consul General Rachel Galloway. Thank you, Samantha.
Rachel Galloway assumed her post as His Majesty's Consul General in Atlanta in July 2022. Before taking on her current assignment, she served as Her Majesty's Ambassador to the Republic of North Macedonia from 2018 to 2022, where she played a pivotal role in strengthening diplomatic relations in the region. Her diplomatic journey spans various strategic positions, including chair of the Northern African Working Group in the European External Action Service and head of the Neighbourhoods team at the UK Permanent Representation to the European Parliament in Brussels from 2012 to 2015. Galloway's career showcases her dedication to international affairs with notable roles such as Deputy Head of the International Organizations Department at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and Head of the Darfur Section in the Sudan, serving on the Counterterrorism Review Team at Her Majesty's Treasury and as a Foreign and Commonwealth Office representative in Helmand with the Lashkar Gah Provincial Reconstruction Team in 2006. Galloway's early career includes diplomatic assignments in Washington and as the Jamaica and Cuba desk officer at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Galloway studied at the University of Leeds, where she took a BA in Political Science and Government. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Galloway to Georgia College.
This is for you. So as we begin, I have some questions for our distinguished guests, Mrs. Rachel Galloway. All of you here have note cards in front of you. Perhaps the questions that I raise, perhaps comments of the Consul General, will provoke a question that you have for her, and I encourage you to make notes as we have our conversation together with the Consul General. As we begin, Consul General, I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about your career. Of course, right now you're the British Consul General in Atlanta, previously Ambassador to North Macedonia. We heard from Samantha, of course, that you began your career in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, now the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. But could you tell us a little bit about your background, where you got started, and perhaps what drew you into professional diplomacy?
Hi. Thank you very much for having me here today. It's been a real pleasure to visit, and the conversations I've had so far about Milledgeville have been really interesting. So thank you. So where to start? I'm British. I'm from the north of England, a town called Manchester. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't have a career plan. I wasn't one of those people who had a vision of exactly where they were going to be. So I studied political science at university because I thought it was interesting, and not because I thought I'd be a politician at the end of it. And then when I left university, I still didn't know what I wanted to do. I was doing various jobs in London, working in an IT help desk, working for a member of parliament in their parliamentary office, when I saw a job advert, and it said, "From Azerbaijan to Zimbabwe, are you interested in politics?" So I sent off for it, and when it arrived, it was an application for the Foreign Service, something I genuinely never really thought about before. So I thought, okay, and I read about it, and I thought it looked very interesting. And after a relatively long application process, while I continued to do other things so that I could eat food, I ended up in the Foreign Service, in our diplomatic service. So that's kind of how I got into it. So it wasn't that I had some sort of dream of negotiating and diplomacy. It was just I thought, well, this looks like a really interesting opportunity, and I'm going to try and take it.
Wonderful. So it sounds like perhaps diplomacy found you as much as you found diplomacy. You began as a parliamentary researcher, and I wonder at what point you decided perhaps it might be more than a job, but in fact a career.
So when I started, you do some time in London, and I had the interesting opportunity. I was put as my first desk was Jamaica and Cuba, so really completely different subjects for the UK. We have really different relationships with both countries. And I thought, well, this is interesting, slightly odd, but it was interesting. And then a job came up in our embassy in Washington, which was covering our relationships with Latin America and the Caribbean. So I thought, okay, well, I've been working on that. This is a great opportunity. And I applied in around 2000 and the beginning of 2002. So we'd just gone into Afghanistan after September 11th. The conversations around conflict in Iraq were first happening. So I arrived in the embassy in Washington at this incredibly exciting time, this really close relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States. I was like 24 years old and was getting into meetings with really senior officials in State Department because I represented Britain, a really close partner. And it was just the most incredible experience and the most incredible opportunity. And I thought, yes, this is what I want to do.
You told us you studied political science, correct?
Yes.
You wrote, I believe you wrote a thesis, was it about the politics of lying? Is that right?
No, it was one of the courses we did, was the politics of lying.
The lying.
Of lying,
so
yes.
Not telling the truth.
The politics of not telling the truth, and what the implications were of that, and where it had been used to good effect and where it had been used to negative effect. It was a very interesting course. I also did a course on the politics of leadership, and there was some overlap.
Yeah, leadership, and that's a sobering thought, isn't it?
Yes.
An important part of your job, of course, is communicating across borders and boundaries. I wonder what languages you studied, and perhaps what languages you've worked to pick up across your career. So in Britain, the language that we mostly learn at school is French. Like most British people, I didn't work very hard at it. It wasn't something that I was particularly interested in. So when I started in the Foreign Office, I had bad French, was where I was. Because my first job included Cuba, I then started learning Spanish. So I had bad Spanish and bad French. I went to Afghanistan
after Washington, but on quite short notice. So I learned some basic, how Pashtun, short conversational, hello, how are you? But obviously you need a real amount of time to do that. Then when I was working in Brussels, the negotiations take place in French or in English, depending on what the topic is, and you don't have translation. So I had this extremely strange experience with my French. So I did a French exam, because you take exams in the office, and one of the questions was about a nuclear-free Middle East. Kicked it out of the park. I fully was able to answer every question and explain everything. The next one was about a train strike, and I didn't know any of the words because I didn't know conversational French. I knew diplomatic French.
Much of conversational French in grade school is learning which train to board and when.
I know. To buy a ticket to Lyon, that's...
That's right.
And then when I got my posting to Macedonia, I learned Macedonian, so I couldn't speak Macedonian, yes.
Okay. My late father worked for the U.S. State Department and had a posting in Macedonia and said that it was one of the hardest languages he's ever tried to acquire in his life. Was that your experience? Or had you flexed that muscle enough by that point?
So funnily enough, it must be just about how your mind works. I find it much easier than French or Spanish.
Oh, wow.
Because it feels logical. I find sometimes when I'm doing languages and you have to turn the sentences all upside down, I know there are language experts in the room because I met one before, but for me, sometimes I'm not quick enough in thinking that. But Macedonian, for me, the logic of the sentence worked, and I didn't find learning the Cyrillic alphabet that difficult. And it was only when the conflict in Ukraine started, and I was seeing Ukraine on the news, and I was like, oh, I can read Ukrainian. I can't understand it when it's spoken, but when I see it written down, I can translate it because there's enough similarities across the languages.
And that's a powerful feeling, I think, to at least be conversant.
Yeah.
On the subject of language, if anyone goes to your Twitter feed at @Galloway UK, one of your recent postings, I will on December 8th, you said, "Happy Hanukkah, y'all." You've only been in Georgia for a year and a half, but you've gotten very good at y'all, as evidenced by your Twitter posts, or X postings.
Yes.
How did you come by your command of our dialect?
So I have had it taught to me. I understand the grammatic singular of y'all and the plural of all y'all.
You don't have that in Manchester.
We don't have
No.
that. But I have to say, it's really unfair, but my 12-year-old has started saying y'all, and he says it in totally English sentences, and we laugh every time. And then the other thing he says, which has come from school, it's not come from home, is he says dang, which to me makes him sound like a gold prospector from a cartoon. And I laugh every single time, and it's very mean.
Well, I will say, you've done very well.
Okay, thank you.
That was right after, or 2 days before, a picture from an Atlanta Falcons game. So it looks like you have hit the ground running in Georgia, and in just your short time here, you've gotten to know certainly the state of Georgia, the community that you live in, but much of the Southeast fairly well.
So the most enjoyable thing about being a diplomat is going around the world and being in places that are different from where you're from and enjoying the culture. And there's a tendency in Britain that we think Americans are just Brits with funny accents, that you're not that different. But actually, in a lot of ways, you come to the Southeast and it does feel very different from the UK. So trying to experience it is not going to be just having meetings about trade policy. It's about watching the Atlanta Falcons. I will admit, not my favorite thing in the entire world. We went to NASCAR at Talladega. That was fun. We went to Dollywood. We're learning to drink bourbon. I like fried chicken. I'm not persuaded by biscuits. Sorry. Kids really like them, so we're getting there. But it's just taking these moments to see what other people enjoy. The other privilege of living in Georgia is just how beautiful it is, and getting out into the mountains, into the landscape. I mean, on Saturday, I went to DeSoto Falls. It was absolutely freezing, and we were the only people mad enough to have gone up into the mountains. But it was gorgeous, the waterfall and the ice, and just really feel very lucky to be able to live here and experience it.
So I wonder if you can tell us then, as Consul General, what are your general responsibilities in your posting?
Okay, so I'll just go back to the very basic fact of an embassy. So an embassy, which represents between two countries' relationships. So the British embassy in a country is responsible for the relationship with that country and represents the government. That's always in the capital, in the political capital. So consulates are in countries which are either big enough and important enough for us to need to have relationships outside of the capital. So our consulate covers 6 states of the Southeast. So we have Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. So first thing is, and for us is our first responsibility as British citizens. So if you're an American citizen and you get into difficulty overseas, you go to your embassy. If you're a British citizen in the Southeast and you have some sort of difficulty, you have been arrested, you've been caught up in a hurricane, we're the people who help you. We work on trade. So we are encouraging British businesses to understand all the exciting opportunities there are in the southeast of the US and getting them. We help them to come here, have trade missions, link up with the state government, the counties. And then in reverse, we want Americans businesses to come to the UK. So we encourage those links. We help people understand what their barriers are and how we can help. Then there's cultural links. Then there's sports links. We had the English Premiership come out this summer and play soccer games. I say soccer. It makes me shudder, but I say it. Play soccer games in Atlanta. We had, people have now heard of, hilariously, Wrexham come out and play a game in North Carolina. So we have that kind of helping people on the sports side. Science, what can we share in the science and technology area? How do we deal with AI? We'll have an AI technology event. In fact, tomorrow morning we'll be running a workshop on that. And then there's also the relationship between the universities. We want students, young people, to understand the opportunities there are for experiences in the UK, whether that's scholarships, whether that's travel abroad programs, whether it's the opportunity for faculty members to do or postgrads to do research together. So we're kind of working across such a broad range of areas that the biggest problem, if I'm honest, is working out what to actually spend your time doing, because there's too much to do and too much opportunity.
So you take in a large territory. If you were, say, responsible for a comparable territory in Europe, you would be doing it with an entire embassy and probably a larger staff.
So given the size of the states here, these would be small to medium-sized European countries. We'd have an embassy in each of them, but the facts are the facts, and you are limited by your resource, but we have a big team. We're one of the biggest consulates because we take this region seriously and want to build these relationships.
And can you tell us about that team? Probably have people broken up into different subject areas. What sorts of work do they take in?
Yeah, so we look similar to an embassy. So we have a press and political team, which is headed up by my colleague Caitlin. So her job is everything from relationships with the media and with journalists here through to trying to explain to London and Washington the politics of this region. Not the easiest task always. We have a team that's totally focused on trade and the trade relationship, and also trade policy. So that's not just supporting businesses, but is about where are their barriers, what do we need states to do slightly differently so we can get more companies, what are problems US companies finding going to the UK, how can we solve those? We have, I mentioned the Consulate team, we have science and innovation, focused on the science, and we actually have in our consulate a Welsh office, so representing the Welsh government and promoting Wales in the region.
On that, I'll note that the flowers on your table, everyone, there's an English rose and a Scottish thistle, there's Irish shamrock, and those yellow ones are the Welsh daffodil. So we tried to make sure that the entire UK is represented.
Thank you very much.
Of course. I'd remind us all here that this forum focuses on leadership that brings people together. The namesake for this forum was the U.S. Secretary of Labor, W.J. Usery, Jr. And an important element of the work that you do, of course, is helping people to see something they may not see otherwise. Not everybody in this room will go into perhaps professional diplomacy, but I wonder if you could tell us, as folks who maybe have conversations with people who see things differently than others, talk with people who we may disagree with. What are some of the practices that you have identified, and what are some of the habits that you've cultivated to have conversations, perhaps, with people who absolutely do not see eye to eye with you? How do you have those conversations, and what do you do as a communicator and as a leader?
So I think there are a number of different tools that you use. And yes, you use them in diplomacy, but you also use them and have to use them in your day-to-day life. So I think the first one is something that I mentioned about what I enjoy about the experience of being a diplomat, which is coming and trying to understand other people's cultures and where people might be coming from. And I think that is an important point. If you're going to understand and have a conversation with someone who's coming at an issue from a different perspective, you actually need to understand why they have it, and not just assume it's because they're wrong, but that maybe there's been a whole set of reasons, cultural or otherwise, how they've come to this different place. The second thing I think is that sometimes the only way you're ever going to be able to work with people you have different views with is by building a relationship. You have to have some sort of grounds for talking rather than just shouting a difference of opinions. And I think one of the tools that I have found has worked in my career has been trying to find a subject which you both care about, which isn't necessarily the point on the table. I'm going to give an example which might sound odd because in some ways it's a subject which people argue about. But I'll give the example of climate change, right? So I know that people come at it from different perspectives. But in my last posting, I was in a place in a country that had become quite divided. So on the political scene, you had kind of a very nationalist party, very much focused on one side, and then you had a party with a very different approach. And we'd reached a point it was quite difficult to get those people to sit at a table with each other. There'd even been a physical fight in the parliament, right? There was photos of it around the world. But even though climate change can sometimes be a dividing issue between left and right, it was having an impact on rural communities. The rain was coming at a different time of year, which was affecting the crops. So the people who traditionally are supposed to not be interested in a conversation about climate change wanted to have a conversation about not necessarily how you stopped it, but how you mitigated it. So I used my house as an opportunity to get people from quite different places on the political spectrum to come together and talk about a very practical issue about what they were going to do for farming communities. So by having a conversation topic that felt like something that they all really cared about, it mattered to everyone that the agriculture wasn't badly affected and that they still had food growing and livelihoods for rural communities, you were able to get people round the table. And that worked at times. There were other times where simply people weren't willing to come and sit at the table. And you have to accept that sometimes you can't get everyone into a conversation. The other thing I think I would say, which I think is very damaging in political life, is the idea of winning, that you always have to win. And my job in Brussels was about negotiation, and in the EU you had, at that time, 28 countries around the table. And I had a couple of colleagues who, I'm not going to name the nations, who sometimes we had the same issue as them, so we would get together to try and solve it. And at the end, say we had got the outcome that we wanted out of the negotiation, they would make it really clear that they'd won, that they'd got what they wanted. And it really started to create a bad atmosphere because those countries who were on the other side of the table felt like they'd lost. And then the next time we had to have an argument about something, they came in already angry. They came in already unwilling to negotiate. And it was a much better outcome for us to get 90% of what we wanted, but to allow the other side to go away with something, so they didn't feel like they'd lost, they'd been destroyed, we won, you lost, but that we'd found a solution. And I think that when trying to deal with people who don't have the same view as you, there are times when you want an outcome that they might not want, and you still have to try and get it because it's what you care about. But how you then behave afterwards is about how you're going to have a relationship going forward. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Well, no, it was an excellent answer, and I hear you saying at least two, if not three things. Mm-hmm. One is that there are many mechanisms by which we can build a relationship. We don't always have to launch into the thing that might divide us. Mm-hmm. I am by training a historian of the Cold War, and many negotiations during the Cold War began with confidence-building measures. Yes. We can exchange our students and ballet and soccer team and ways to build mutual relationship before we work into the heavy stuff like export controls, arms negotiation, and so forth. So I hear you saying that. I also heard you say, in the case of your previous posting, sometimes it's helpful to bring in a third party. In that case, you were perhaps the willing third party to help to bring people together. Mm-hmm. And I also hear you say that, in short, a rising tide lifts all boats. Mm-hmm. There's an old truism in politics, it's amazing what you'll accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we have to think about the longer-term outcome, not just the shorter-term victory.
Yes. Good summarizing.
Yeah. It's an occupational hazard.
Excellent.
Are there other things, perhaps, that you have practiced, or can you think of an example, maybe, where you went into a situation and it just seemed like an intractable situation, and you had to have a face-to-face conversation with someone with whom you absolutely disagreed? How do you confront that?
So I think in my last job I had to do a reasonable amount of meetings with people who I really disagreed with, and on some issues. One thing that I think is a bit easier in my job is it's quite easy when it's the position of the British government. You know, when I first arrived in Skopje in Macedonia, it was actually my first experience of doing my job publicly. All of my other jobs had been about negotiating with foreign governments. But this was my first job where I had a lot more interaction with the public. And it was my first time of having a public Twitter account. I'd had one before, but I'd only ever lurked on it and read things. I hadn't really used it. And in the first week or two, to my absolute horror, strangers were saying terrible things to me on the internet. They were saying things about what I thought, what I said, how I looked, and it was it made me really upset.
You had become a public official very quickly.
Because I'd become a public official, and I'd become a publicly female in a macho environment, and all of these things. And then it was like a couple of weeks into it, and somebody was really shouting at me about this one particular issue online. And I was just thinking, yes, that's the position of the British government. I'm not really a person here. It doesn't really matter that you're saying rude things about me. I'm representing a position. So one of the people who I met with, because I had to meet with him in my last job, was the Russian ambassador. And we had a perfectly pleasant relationship. We would have a polite conversation about polite issues, and we would talk about the politics of the day. And then we would have a 2-minute, really aggressive conversation with each other where we really strongly disagreed. And then we would sort of sit back and carry on the conversation. And I found it very strange because it wasn't personal. It was just that there were some things that he said that as a representative of the British government, I simply couldn't accept. Yes. So I needed to say back our position. And then, of course, the conflict, Russia invaded Ukraine, and our relationship changed, because you do have to have a different relationship at that point. But there was still some value in the fact that we had, over time, built a relationship where we could have conversations, even if in this new environment it was more difficult to do so.
You and I studied political science as an undergraduate about the same time you did, and you and I both came of age as students when there were certain truths about world politics that really seemed beyond dispute. That the UN Charter and the rule of law were sacred, that globalization of markets was inevitable, that negotiation was always preferable to force, that the United States would never abandon NATO and the United Kingdom would never abandon the European Union. And now, many of those ideas have been tested. I think if we could go back and tell our college-age selves what the world looked like in 2024, we'd be pretty surprised. And I wonder, from your position, can you help to shed some light on that? I'm surprised by it. Perhaps you've seen many of these things building for the past couple of decades.
I'm not going to pretend to have predicted all the things of the last couple of decades. I do think there was some tendency in kind of political analysis to gloss over some of the things that were happening and pretend things that were definitely going to go in one direction forever, even though all of human history told us that that wasn't how things worked. A real tell for me, actually, just because of where I was, as I said, in Macedonia, in the Balkans, when Russia invaded Ukraine. And all of these Western papers all over the world kept saying the first war in Europe since the Second World War.
Absolutely not.
And everywhere I was like, do you remember us? We spent most of the 90s in a terrible, terrible set of conflicts. So this kind of idea, there was a phrase I read in a book. I'm trying to remember the name of the book, but it was describing. It said it was fiction. It was a novel. It wasn't about conflict. It said it was that period of peace between the fall of the wall and the fall of the towers. I thought it was a beautiful, evocative phrase, but again, not true. In mainland Europe and the US, things were very peaceful, but all over in these other places, things were very different. And you say, for example, you mentioned the UK, I will speak frankly, I don't think you can pretend that in the United Kingdom there was ever full agreement and inclusion and a feeling of being in the European Union to the same extent that there was in other European Union members. There was always that kind of Euroscepticism. Now, would I have predicted that we would vote to leave the European Union? I don't know that I would have done. Well, I know that I didn't do. But I don't think it was so... I don't think it was such a drastic, completely unexpected change.
So perhaps a good example for us to explore is the globalization of markets. Certainly in the past, in the United Kingdom and in the United States, we've seen a backlash against the globalization of markets. In recent years, increased isolationism, increased protectionism, and I wonder what guidance would you offer to our students in maybe understanding those trends?
So I think the problem is that the trends are not the same as one another, and that different things are happening at the same time and are being put under one umbrella. And I'd look at the example of, okay, let's take a few elections that have happened in the last kind of 10 years. So, or votes that have happened in the last 10 years. So in the United Kingdom, we had a referendum, do you want to stay in the European Union, yes or no? And the people voted no, okay? And it was predicted they would vote yes, but people voted no. In the United States, 2016 election, very different type of Republican candidate for the first time, won the primaries, then won the election. Not necessarily expected. In Greece, for the first time, you had a party from the far left, very far left, hadn't really been in power before. It came after a difficult economic period, but you had this party, the far left. In France, President Macron came to power, completely destroying the political system. He was not of one of the main political parties that had been in power for as long as you could remember. Right. So, for me, all of these elections were actually asking the same question. Do you, the population, like how things are now, or do you want to change? And people voted for a change. In the UK, that meant Brexit. In the US, President Donald Trump. In France, President Macron. These three things, two of these things are not like the other. They're not the same as each other. They're very different outcomes, but they're different outcomes to the same question. And I think protectionism and globalization are sort of the same question. I'm not sure the UK was voting to be isolationist. We're actually very free trade. Actually, we're much closer to, say, Germany and Canada than we are to the US, into the United States on our views on trade. So I don't think people were voting against trade. What they were voting for is, I'm not completely happy with things as they are. You are offering me a change. I'm voting for that change. So I think what you've got to look at it as is it's a moment of opportunity. It's a moment to seize and see, okay, there's a lot of people out there looking for difference and looking for change. And it doesn't all need to be protectionist. It doesn't all need to be isolationist. And in fact, in the last few years, we've had some very positive global operations. So, response to COVID, sharing of vaccines didn't go well, was not in the initial stages a good example of globalization, but actually very, very quickly mechanisms were set up to share vaccines, to share research. Okay, we've had in the last few years, despite what people might read in newspapers, actually some really good progress on climate, with treaties on the high seas, for example, being negotiated for the first time. So I think there's opportunity, and there's an opportunity to make things positive, but it has to come with an understanding that in a lot of places, people are not feeling completely served by their current political options, and they are looking for something different. And the question is, how do you give them options which are positive and take us forward together rather than away from each other?
Very well said. I know that we have some questions in the audience. We have a microphone that will be coming around to you. So if you have a question for the Consul General, if you would, raise your hand. Please wait for the microphone to come to you to help our online guests be able to hear the question. Say your name and say what your question is. So what questions do we have in this audience? I see that we have a question. It looks like Cassie right here. So let's get the microphone back to Cassie. please.
Hello. First off, I just want to thank you so much for coming, and it is a true honor to listen and hear from you today. Like Dr. Mock just said, my name is Cassie. So I know from our previous interaction, we discussed that when you first assumed your role here in Atlanta, the first crisis that you had to deal with was the Queen's passing. And so my question to you is just from your team's kind of press and media standpoint view, what role did you play in like addressing that and just how your team dealt with that?
Thank you for the question. So that was about 5 or 6 weeks after I arrived. It's something that, of course, we do prepare for reasons best known to Her Majesty's government. Any material relating to the possible passing of the Queen was called Operation London Bridge. Anytime you got anything on it. So I woke up in the morning, saw the news that she was sick, but it was done in a way I'd never ever seen before. It was very clear to me that we were in a very serious phase. So I sent a message out to the team saying, I need everyone in my office at 9 o'clock. We're having an Operation London Bridge meeting. If you don't know what that is, we will have to tell you at 9 o'clock. And then actually the truth is we were very well prepared, and we were able to, in fact, sitting here in the United States, there wasn't that much that we had to do, and we had a number of kind of news media from across the region contacted us, wanted to ask us questions about how the funeral was done, how the funeral would be held, what were some of the kind of protocols around it. Obviously, no one in the team had ever been through this before, so we were very much working from the materials that we were sent by the Palace and by the Foreign Office. And then an organisation based in Atlanta decided to show the funeral live on big screens in Atlanta at kind of 5 a.m. So we went along and took part of that. And again, it was really nice to see the range of people who wanted to come along and wanted to share their condolences with us. And it was really quite moving for me that it was one thing, the kind of formal part of it, that yes, the governor writes and the Secretary of State, and we have all that formal contact. But actually, people in the street, people in Kroger, heard me speaking English and came over to offer their condolences. And that was very nice. And so it actually, on a personal level, although it was sad, it was actually quite a nice moment for understanding and seeing some of the closeness of the relationship here in Georgia.
It occurs to me, partly in response to Cassie's question, not only are you a professional diplomat, you're also a sort of trade ambassador, an emissary, you're a public relations official. I wonder what other titles might we give you, because you very quickly had that just after your arrival, followed by an election that you had to help people to understand.
So one of the best things about the job is how different it can be from day to day. So you can be doing something as formal and serious as kind of condolences on the passing of a royal, as interesting as explaining a election and midterms and explaining all of the consequences around that, through to opening a fish and chip shop. You've got that variety. My best kind of sort of high-level week of diplomacy was from my last job. On the Sunday, the president was inaugurated, and I went to his inauguration. So Sunday was the president. On the Monday, Tuesday, Prince Edward came for a visit, and we took him round for the meetings. So I had a prince. And on the Wednesday, the Pope came. So I got to be in a small event with the Pope at the president's house. So I had a president, a prince, and a Pope in 1 week. You're not going to get that experience in that many jobs.
Absolutely not. What other questions do we have in the audience? Put your hand up. I see Katie has the microphone. Right over here, and then to the front, Katie.
Hey, my name is Gail, and I'm an econ major here. I wanted to ask, what were some previous convictions or belief that you had overturned in working in different countries? Things that you didn't expect to be maybe controversial or not as a worldly view as you previously might have thought.
Sorry, say the last bit
So
again.
I think positions of yours that maybe were overturned, by your travels or your work.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think, while I think about that first bit, I mean, I do think that sometimes there are more cultural differences than you expect, that places are slightly more different, that you think people think like you, and then suddenly they surprise you in a conversation because they're coming at an issue from a completely different place and you've sort of forgotten their personal experience. And to give an example of that, in Brussels, I was in the Eastern European negotiating committee, and my Lithuanian colleague, who was much older than anyone else in the committee and was a very elegant, well-spoken gentleman, suddenly was getting quite passionate on some of the Russia-Ukraine issues. And he wasn't that sort of person. I mean, the French and the Spanish were always passionate about everything, but he was kind of that more sort of sober Eastern European. And then one day the two of us was just chatting, and he said to me, when I was conscripted into the Soviet army, and I was like, right, I've not quite taken into account your cultural background. But thinking about what my own convictions are that have changed, I feel like I should maybe have grown more as a person and not kept to all my convictions. I think I've probably become more wishy-washy. I think I've probably, on some issues, moved more to the centre as I've gone round the world and seen things from different angles. And I think some of the things that I thought and felt very strongly about when I was younger, that I couldn't understand how anyone could disagree with me, I've ended up being a bit, not on everything, I obviously have some core issues where I do have my own personal beliefs, but I think that's probably where I've ended up being a bit more sort of wishy-washy, seeing both sides.
Excellent question. Thank you, Gail. We have a question just here.
All right, my name is Jacob Crook. I'm here with my professors. I'm a teacher, just trying to get into the admin now, so hopefully they can help me. My wife is over there with her cohort, and this is actually more for them because it's kind of fascinating because, well, actually, let me make one statement. Fried chicken's not really quite Southern. Fried pork chops, country fried steak, and barbecue are really the true, and collards are truly the Southern
So those
cuisine.
are three things that
So
you
you
have.
need to eat those. And the question, because what you're talking about is what teachers deal with, everything you're talking about. And I'm sitting there thinking about them because your job seems really, really cool. So I'm thinking as a teacher seems like it'd be a perfect person to go into diplomacy like you're doing. So I don't know for them if it's, I'm too old. I'm about to retire. But for them, maybe it's something that they could look at doing.
But education might be a path into
it's
professional
what you're talking about
diplomacy.
is exactly what you deal with teenagers and parents.
So, to take that in two parts, yes, I have been experiencing barbecue, and I should have mentioned it, and I apologise. And my husband smoked the largest brisket about a month ago, and we're still eating that. So my barbecue, maybe a little bit of a break on barbecue. No, I have very much enjoyed that. Yes, I think teaching is actually somewhere where diplomatic skills are incredibly important. And in the British diplomatic service, I can speak less to the American diplomatic service. Actually, I have colleagues who've come from a range of backgrounds, including teaching, because what you're looking for in a diplomat is someone who just is able to talk to different people and is able to go into different environments. And it doesn't need to be someone with a political science degree. In fact, I would say probably less people in the office have political science degrees than they do come from different places.
I think I'd like to pursue that just a moment. Say there's a young person in this audience, well, maybe not, maybe anybody in this audience who is struck by the work that you do and might want to become a diplomat, what path might you recommend for them? It could be, of course, education or books to read, languages to learn. What might that look like if someone wanted to pursue a path similar to yours?
So I think obviously language skills are important, but you don't need to have them before you come in. But that interest, having done things that show that you have an interest in the world, that you have an interest in language, that you have an interest in other cultures, that can be anything. It can be taking advantage of a Georgia College study abroad program in Strasbourg. That can be part of it, or it could be that actually volunteering with a local organization. I mean, Georgia is full of organizations that are thinking internationally. There's a large number of NGOs here, but there's also in the business community all these businesses who are headquartered in Georgia but have offices all over the world, and then there's international businesses who come here. So going and taking the opportunity to work in any of those and seeing if you can get time abroad or be working with international clients, all of those things are helpful. It doesn't have to be kind of that government experience. You can get it from anywhere. But just it's showing that interest, it's showing that you are interested in other people and the rest of the world.
Wonderfully said. I wonder what other questions we have in the audience. I see right back here, Stuart and Axel. And then we'll come over here. Emma has a question. Stuart, go ahead.
I'm Stuart. When you were negotiating at any of your jobs, whether that be now or previously, was there a time that you disagreed with the UK's government's position that they were asking you to take? And was that difficult you, or were you able to just sort of compartmentalize that as part of the job, if that makes sense?
Okay. I don't think I can name the issue, but I was working in Brussels, and there was one day. So I worked on this sort of Middle East, North Africa committees, and they were split in two. And in the morning, I had to go and explain and argue very firmly for something to do with sanctions. It was Iran. I had to argue, why we needed to sanction this particular organization in Iran. And in the afternoon, in the other half of the committee, I had to go and argue the exact opposite, using the exact opposite arguments on a different country. And what I kept trying to go back to London and say was, they're the same people. It's the same committee. They're two different countries, but I'm making this argument to two different people. It's humiliating. It's so unthought through and stupid. And one set of arguments was good and one set of arguments was stupid. I'm not going to say which way round. And I lost the debate. It was two different teams. They weren't either willing to give up their position. I couldn't get it escalated, which is what you normally do. You get someone higher up to come in, but no one would. And I do my job properly, and I had to sit in the room and do it, and people laughed. And, I'm a human being, and it made me feel embarrassed. But I did my job, and I succeeded in one and not in the other because it was an impossible task. So the thing was, I thought the instruction there was stupid. What I've never had to face is the question of, do I need to say something which I fundamentally goes against what I believe in? And I've not had to have that. I do know people who felt on certain issues that the line was crossed and they resigned. And I think, in a way, that's probably the only option if it really, at a certain point, goes against what you truly believe in, I think would be my answer.
Thank you for that question, Stuart.
Hi, I'm Axel Hawkins. I'm Student Body Vice President. First, on the note of Southern food, as a Kentucky native, I have to recommend fried catfish and hush puppies. That's one of my favorites. Now, my real question, you mentioned working in the Balkans and Eastern Europe in a very macho, male-dominated environment, and certainly maybe we're not as bad in the West, but we're still a very male-dominated society. And as a woman in public life and in the diplomatic corps especially, I was wondering what advice you would have for young women who are entering into politics and having to navigate that environment.
So, I have had catfish. It was excellent. I don't know what a hush puppy is, so I have no idea whether I've had one. Yeah, so I think when I applied for the diplomatic service, they actually asked me in one of the interviews how it would feel as a bright young woman working with men who didn't want to hear your opinion, which was a great question to be asked in the interview process. So I think generally my experience has been broadly positive. And that in most of my experience in the office, I have not felt disrespected for being a woman. And within the British Foreign Service, I think it was about 3 years ago, for the first time ever, we hit 50% of our ambassadors around the world were women. And were women in some of our most serious posts, Moscow, Washington, the United Nations. So, you know, but I have worked in places where you do feel that you're not maybe wanted as much in the room, that there is an environment where maybe some people are going for drinks and you're not invited. I know the kind of American equivalent is you're going for golf and not being invited. So the thing I did was find the colleagues who were willing to work with you anyway, to find actually environments where you could socialize with people in different ways. So in some places, in Brussels, we set up a women's group. That was fun. You know, that was one way of doing it. But in other places, it was finding other things and other ways of being able to cross that barrier and to be in the room and to be part of the decision-making process and not to be left out of it. But I think the key is again, it's about building the relationships. It's about finding the people who are just willing to engage with you because you do your job well, or you are a competent, helpful, friendly colleague, and they want to help you go forward, and they might help you when they see behavior that is not necessarily helpful. There are, of course, just moments I particularly found when working with the military where people would just say things to me and I would think, well, that was completely unacceptable, and just smile sweetly because you let it go and it was the easiest way. But as I got more senior in my career, I was able to say, I think next time we won't do it like that.
Well said. We have a question over here. Emma?
Hi, good evening. Thank you, first of all, for coming. My name is Emma Van, and my question is, as someone who's about to graduate from Georgia College and then go on for my master's in health policy, what skills do you think are most valuable for someone who is wanting to go into policymaking?
So I feel bad about my answer to the question about not having changed any of my convictions. Because, of course, the answer with policymaking is not to go into it thinking you know what the answer is. And a lot of it is about understanding what the question is and what the problem that you're trying to solve is. And if you spend a bit more time on that, then it's easier to understand who can help you answer the question and how they can help you answer the question. So it's kind of that sort of open skill. And then the next thing is really in policy making is really, really good evaluation of impact, really understanding what you've been doing and evaluating whether it's had the impact that you wanted. And I think one of the things that I've seen in my career that's been a real negative is we have an expression in the British Civil Service. It's called lessons learned. So after something's happened, you do a lessons learned exercise and you write a paper with all the things that you've learned, and then you bury it for 1,000 years. And then the next time the same things happens, you do exactly the same things as before, and then you write a new lessons learned paper. And it's just the worst approach to policy making. And I think that we've spent a lot of time in the last few years trying really, really, really hard to think about evaluation, to admit that what you did didn't work is a real skill, and in some cases that it's not working and you should stop it, because you are spending government money, you are spending taxpayers' money, and you shouldn't be throwing it away. You should be able to say, you know what, we tried this, it's not working, therefore we stop, we look at why, and we work out what we do again. But I think that these are the things you need to bring to effective policy making.
Very well said. I have just a few last questions for you. Number one, if you could go back and talk to your 18 or 20-year-old self, what are one or two pieces of advice that you would give to a younger Rachel Galloway?
So I'd have a really long conversation about some of my hairstyle choices, because they were not good. But once we got past that, I think, in a way, I'd say, do pick the things that are interesting. You know, I've tried to, in my career, go for the things that I've found interesting, rather than necessarily being the things that are about the most attention or promotion, but just things. And that's what makes your life and your career more interesting, more fun, more engaging, and more possible to have impact. Because if you're enjoying what you're doing, you care more about it and you try harder. So I think that that would be my key advice. Oh yes, always be nice to people. You know, there's no excuse for being bad-tempered with people. That's probably my biggest regret, that there have been times where, you know, I've been stressed, like work has been difficult, but you could be warmer and kinder. You will never go wrong if you are.
I'm always curious about this with people. What is your favorite book? What is the most important book you've read or encountered in your life?
So my favorite book's by an American author. It is John Steinbeck, and it's called The Moon is Down. So it's in one of his novellas. It's set in an unnamed country, which is France, during an unnamed war, which is the Second World War. And when it came out, it was criticized in the American press, because it came out during the Second World War, and it was criticized in the American press for being overly sympathetic towards the occupying soldiers, which are the Germans. But the Germans also read the book, and they actually understood better than the American press what it was about, because it's about the human spirit, and it's about resistance. So they banned the book. And it's this absolutely beautiful book. It's written in incredibly simple language, and it's just this occupation of this small town, but it represents kind of the whole war. And after the Germans banned it, the French resistance translated it into French and made copies and distributed it all across France, because they understood what it was about. I'm actually very, very privileged, because I have a French resistance copy.
Wow.
And it's kind of my favorite possession
your
in the
special
world.
Possession, you
Yes.
probably take it with you on all your postings.
I do, and it's just one of these things. It was incredibly cheap and on eBay. And
Wow.
I've got the certification, so it is what it is, but it was just, you know, someone who didn't want it. But I think that's my favorite book, because it's just about humanity, and it's just really, really beautiful. I can't recommend it enough.
My very last question for you, as someone who travels a lot, has seen much of the world, what leaves you optimistic about the future?
So, it's a slightly longer answer. I'll give you a fact, okay? So, about 30 years ago, if you read a newspaper, I'm talking like a mainstream, we call them broadsheets, but main paper, 1 in 9 articles was negative, right? Which means the other 8 were positive stories about things that were happening, okay? Now, it's changed. It's 1 in 30 are positive, right? And the other 29 in an average broadsheet, an average newspaper, are negative. So you end up with this incredibly negative view of everything that's happening. And the truth is, bad things are happening. I'm not going to pretend in a world that currently has a number of wars and, in a range of different places, that things are all rosy and good. But the fact is, everything we're fed is negative. We see so much negativity, and there's been so much that has been good in the last few years with medical advances, cures for malaria, gene editing. And then I mentioned climate change again. I mentioned it earlier because every article about climate change is always, always negative. Last year, in 2023, just because of electric vehicles, nothing else, the increase of electrical vehicles in the world reduced oil consumption by 1.8 million barrels of oil a day, okay? And it's expected to increase even more this year. There's been all sorts of international treaties in progress on climate, on healthcare, on scientific advances. And I just think that in so many areas we're going in the right direction, and there's so much opportunity for change, but people just have to believe in it and try to take advantage of it.
Wow. Well, what a wonderful note to end on. Please join me in thanking the Consul General, Rachel Galloway, for joining us at Georgia College.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you do not have a copy of our Ideas Bulletin, I would encourage you, you can download it. It is online, features some of the best ideas to come out of our Usery Forum in the past year. I also want to point your attention to a couple of opportunities coming up. The Consul General mentioned that we have a leadership program based at the European Parliament in Strasbourg. I will be teaching you all there this summer. We have a virtual information session about that tomorrow, Tuesday. We have a reception with Northwestern Mutual if you're interested generally in opportunities in Middle Georgia and in South Georgia. A great opportunity to learn more about that this coming Wednesday. And of course, the next installment in our Usery Forum on Leadership will be Monday, February 19th, featuring Deke Copenhaver. Mr. Copenhaver is an author, a consultant, a change-making leader. He served as the mayor of Augusta-Richmond County and has just written a really wonderful book and is going to join us at Georgia College Monday, February 19th. So I invite you to that, the next event in our Usery Forum on Leadership this year. With that said, please continue to keep the conversation going using the hashtag #ForThePublicGood, and you can do that online using our social media handles, Lead Creatively, @LeadCreatively. Please join me again in thanking our distinguished guest. We're so fortunate she visited us, Rachel Galloway. Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here.